Before I go to those phases, I've got a section in there that I've called the golden rules of writing. So these are rules, if you like, or principles that I think are worth discussing, which can be applied generally to everything we write. And so I just wanted to share some of my thoughts on rules of writing. And the first slide, Charlotte, has the first of the 3 rules. Rule 1, writing is forever. Never write anything that you will regret later. And I put in there a few examples of what you will inevitably regret later. That is disparaging or offensive remarks. So, for example, in a letter, look, Mr. Smith, I have told you 5 times already that your case is utterly hopeless. That sort of language that expresses an opinion, if you like, about the person who's writing to you. False or misleading assertions, entirely obviously are to be avoided, and inaccurate or unfounded depictions of fact. If you were to change your application and reduce it from 5 stories down to 3 stories, council will support that an application to that effect. Now you can write that in a letter, so long as it's got a proper foundation to it. And too often I've seen letters expressed as assertions or depictions of fact when they're really just opinions. And it's important that you don't express something as being a fact, particularly if it's a false fact, in a letter, because, as I say, you'll regret it later. Rule number 2, if you cannot understand what you have written, almost certainly no one else will. In making that rule, I don't say that literally. I think with effort, most people will be able to understand what most other people write. You'll eventually get there. What I'm really endeavouring to say by that rule is, if a person can't read what you've written in an easy manner, that it doesn't come easy to the person reading it, then there is at least room to improve. But at the complete other end, of course, if it literally is impossible for someone to understand what you're saying, then if you can't understand what it is you've written after you've reread it, or if you have to reread something and 3 times before you really understand what you've just written, then you need to go back, because that is not effective writing. I say this quite often, I should say, to strategic planners as part of the exercise of putting pen to paper, having done all the strategic planning work, the job of then reflecting what you've done in writing, and that sort of concept of peer reviewing, of having someone come in and read what you've written so that they can test that what you've wished something to say actually says it, and that it's easily comprehended. So that's my rule number 2. Rule number 3 is, if you think you have written too much, you almost certainly have. That's a strange rule, I concede, but when I formulated that rule, I had in mind a quote or a letter, or the end of a letter from Oscar Wilde to a friend of his, where, having written a very detailed letter, the final words were, "If I had have had more time, I would have made this letter shorter." Now, what did he mean by that? He meant that to be precise, to be concise, takes time. You need to, your brain needs to work in a way which says, I'm going to make my point in the the minimum amount of time of words, but that actually takes effort, because it is actually easier to just rattle the words off, just keep writing, keep the pen going, or the computer going. And what happens in that desire to just move forward with your writing is you just write, and you continually write, and then you've written too much. And if you think you've written too much, you have. And if you've got time, you go back and you start to condense it down. Part of what I have to do at Maddocks is to sign off on letters of advice that our lawyers write. And I can say to you with hand on heart that I can almost guarantee that I can cut a letter down by 20% just by taking out all superfluous words, superfluous expressions, and so forth and so forth. So it is possible to keep things short, to make your points in a short way, and and my strong view is that that makes your writing much more effective, including in submissions. So if we can go to the next slide, Charlotte. A lot of you would have seen these sort of rules before. Always draft to the audience. It is one thing to be drafting a submission to VCAT, which has expertise in the subject matter, as opposed to writing to objectors that don't have expertise, and more to the point, are quite often quite emotional. Planning is a very emotional topic for a lot of people. So you should always think about the audience that you're writing. There are things that just don't need to be said to VCAT. And in fact, if you do say them, they run the risk of becoming a little condescending. As the tribunal will know, there is a clause 15.03. And in case you didn't know, this is what it says. That's not meant to be condescending. It's meant to be a fulsome examination of all the relevant policy framework. But it doesn't need to be said, because VCAT knows what clause 15.03. I'll say a bit more about that in submission writing, but that's the sort of thing I'm referring to. And if you've got a traffic engineer sitting on the tribunal, then you can be pretty sure that that traffic engineer would be pretty up to date with traffic terminology. So always be conscious of the audience that you're writing to. A couple of small things, but I think important things, and it is one of the reasons why I've got Charlotte to circulate to you a sample of a submission that I had prepared. I'm always a bit reluctant to do that, of course, because it just opens me up to being a reminder of all of the golden rules that I've just breached in that submission. But hopefully it acts as a bit of an example to you of these sort of principles. And the first one of which is active language is more effective than passive. I'm not sure if everyone understands that, but it's the use of verbs instead of nouns. You should apply for a permit, as opposed to an application for a permit should be made. We as humans, for some reason, speak in verbs. We talk about active language, but then we write in the passive language. We convert everything into a noun. The application of a permit instead of applying for a permit. So forth and so forth. The first thing converting everything to a noun does is it means you have to add words. You have to top and tail a noun in order to make it an active language, making an application for a permit. And what that does, if nothing else, means that you're writing in a way that we don't normally talk, and that means it's in a way that we don't normally comprehend things, and you're adding words to a document, including submissions that you don't need to include. So that's the first one. Wherever possible, use active language rather than nouns. Limit the use of adverbs and adjectives. You know, this this proposal is greatly in excess of the discretionary height control of the DDO. Now, I'm not saying, and greatly being the adjective, now I'm not saying that you never use adjectives, because they are very good in emphasising a point. This is significantly outside of the bounds. This will cause significant detriment to the amenity of the area, and so forth and so forth. So there's clearly a role for adjectives, but what I see happen is that you overuse it, and then the risk becomes that you enter into a debate. So, Mr. Smith, and often this happens in cross-examination. So, Mr. Smith, would you agree that that 4 stories is significantly above the two-story mandatory discretionary height control? Now, what's that gonna? What does a question like that going to do? Or if you put it in writing, what's it going to do? Well, Mr. Rantino, I don't know whether I would say significant. What do you mean by significant? And all of a sudden, you find yourself on the back foot. By all means, when you need to, and it's important to emphasise a point, think about objectives, but don't overdo it, especially if you know that what it's going to do is just create debate and put you in a position where you have to explain what you meant. 1 point per sentence is better than 2 or more. This, to me, is a critical rule of writing. Again, quite often in this endeavour to just move along with your writing, we just start typing, or we start writing, and we don't really know when to finish. And what inevitably happens is you have sentences that go for 6 or 7 lines, and embedded within that sentence there will be 3 or 4 points. And then if you do that, the risk is that those points will be lost or will be minimised. The use of the word "and" or the word "or" is the main culprit. You throw in "and" then you just keep the sentence going, and this, and then you make another point and another point or another point, all of which probably have a relationship with each other, but they're not directly related. And that's poor drafting, because we don't speak that way and people don't comprehend that way. I haven't got a great example in mind, but let's say you're in that submission where you're explaining the way in which the permit application was processed. This is not a very good example, but it's an easy one. And you start. An application came in on the 3rd of January, and it was the subject of a request for further information, and that request for further information was complied with on the 10th of March, and then it was public notice was given, and we received 10 objections. Now, that is making 5 points in one sentence. Doesn't really matter there, because no one's really reading that part, caring about that part of your submission. But when you're in the guts of your submission, doing that, you're going to lose things. And so I'm strongly of the view you make 1 point every sentence, and you will find that they are much more effective. And when we get to to look at the sample submission, I'm hoping that I've got at least a couple of good examples of that in my submission. Writing should move through a beginning, a middle, and an end in a clear and logical manner. And that's, again, the way we better comprehend things. And in a small way, that's what I did today. You may recall, what we're going to do is we're going to break it up into components, and we're going to break it up into stages, and this is what we're going to be under each stage. But before I do that, I want to talk about the golden rules of writing. That should be how submissions are written, or lengthy advices, or even officers' reports. This is what I'm going to tell you. And what that does is it makes your advocacy much more effective. because you can keep the listener engaged. They know where you are. In a few minutes, I'm going to be saying to you, now that's all I want to say about the golden rules of writing. Let's move on to the next thing. And you'll know what the next thing is. That's what you need to impart into your writing. Have a beginning, have a middle and an end, and let the person who's reading it know where you are at any one point. And I'll come back to that and we'll flesh that out later. Consistency is vital. Don't use different words or terms to mean the same thing. Again, when we're writing a letter to somebody, this is not the most critical rule that that exists, but it becomes very critical in things like submissions and draft permit conditions. Particularly draft permit conditions. And when I speak to strategic planners, I threaten them with this rule. Not literally, but I threaten them with the observation that if you do not understand this rule and do not apply it, you run a real risk that all the work that you've done in your strategic planning can go down the toilet, because people will misinterpret or misapply or stretch what you've written. And the main culprit is that there is this strong desire of humans to mix it up a bit. Now, I've used the word material 5 times already. I can't keep using it because it doesn't look good. It looks boring. So I'll change the word material to significant, something like that. Now, if you do that, it's going to be assumed that you meant material and significant to mean a different thing. Is everyone following me on that? Is that clear enough? Particularly when it's in permit conditions and things that become effectively the law. Because a permit is a law. So, you know, what we do is we confuse the imperative of consistency with the desire for variation. And the variation then creates inconsistency, it creates debate, and it can end up meaning that the meaning that you meant something to have is lost. So, as a broad rule, if a word invokes what it is you want it to mean, keep using that word, even if it appears 5, 6 or 7 times, because at least it's consistent and at least it means the same thing every time. Don't go changing words only for the reason of variation, unless you are prepared to argue that they were meant to mean the same thing. Use plain English is the last of the rules that I wanted to take you to. And I'm sure you've heard of that many times before. It's a difficult concept to define. What is plain language? I've said many times in the past, plain language does not necessarily mean simplistic language. Sometimes we do tend, especially as lawyers, to just overdo it, trying to convert everything into some sort of simplistic expression, and then find ourselves not having actually reflected what we wanted to say. Plain language means a little different when it comes to town planning, because town planning has a language of its own. We know what an overlay means. We know what a policy means. You know, what the word mandatory means, and so forth and so forth. So to us as town planners, we borrow that language and we use it. The rule is, though, try to be as plain about it and as you can. Convey it in as straightforward a language as you can.